Hello, strangers. Today, I bring you something extra special. Friend of the channel and friend to the person behind it, The Darkness Diaries has elected to favor us with a reading for story 299, and I dare say it's now one of my favorites. So here it is, 299. And here's what happened.
It's amazing what liquor does to a person. I mean, beyond the obvious health decline from prolonged overuse, it lowers inhibitions, temporarily poisoning your good judgment, letting you act and say the things you normally would only think. I have no idea why the scary three-letter agencies are rumored to have spent so much time on sodium pentothal as a truth serum, when they only needed to head as far as their local corner store for some truth in a screw-top bottle. I digress. I used to spend summers with a wide range of family members. Figure my parents wanted a break from my antics. I was passed from grandparents to aunts and uncles. A second or third cousin somewhere in there. Faces I barely remembered save from reunions, weddings, and funerals. That practice stopped suddenly the year I was 11. That year, I had started with my aunt and uncle who had a small home in the suburbs. Said aunt was heavily pregnant, and the understanding was that, after 2 weeks, I would return to my grandpa and grandma's. This lined up with my aunt's due date, and it suited me just fine. Their home was already crowded with their own 3 kids, and getting stepped on or jumped on from the top of a bunk bed was getting a little stale. I think it was also stale for my aunt. She was never mean, but I definitely got the sense that she was biting her tongue about having a random relative crashing her house while she was moments away from the sleepless nights of a newborn. The baby had other plans, though. The night before the day I was meant to return to my grandparents, my aunt went into labor. My uncle was freaking out more than the woman with a child trying to crawl out of her, and quickly started calling family, then friends, to see who could take me earlier. I was told to go open the door at a rapping knock, and there on the stoop was a man I'd never seen before, someone my uncle introduced to me as Uncle Trip. I asked him, "Your name's Trip." He laughed, stubbing a cigarette at my uncle's disapproving look. "Maybe not on any government paperwork, but it works as a name. And a job. Here I am to take you on a little trip, ain't I?" I turned back to my uncle, with the eyebrow raise of a sarcastic tween. He looked at me, half shrugged, then bossed us both outside, near shooing me away as my aunt came along behind him, looking exasperated that they weren't already on their way to the hospital. I followed Uncle Trip, banging my bag into my legs as we rushed out to his waiting beater, some flavor of 80s Ford sedan. He told me the plan was, I was going to stay with him for a night. Then my uncle would come collect me and take me on to my next spot. I shrugged, trying to dodge more embers as he lit up and periodically ashed another cigarette, sending the bright orange sparks flying through the car. That night, I traded the floor of my cousin's room for a couch. It was yellowed. Everything in the house was yellowed. Trip smoked indoors. But at least I didn't have to worry about one of my cousins landing on me trying to get a glass of water in the middle of the night. The next morning, my uncle didn't show. Trip and I sat on the same sofa I'd used as a bed, now watching TV. Say what you will about Trip, but the man had cable and allowed me to watch some of the shows my parents would have made faces and demanded I turn off. Sometime around 4 p.m. or so, my uncle called to say that labor was going into overtime and that he wouldn't be able to come get me until the next morning. Trip seemed fine with this, if a little antsy. When he hung up, he fixed me with a sly look. "Say, your Uncle Trip's getting a little thirsty. Now I told your parents." "My parents are in Texas," I interrupted. "Your parents... people then." He was too distracted to punish me for my sass. "Well, I might have told them I'd stay away from, the adult beverages while I had you. But that promise was good for 24 hours tops. I imagine you're old enough to keep secrets." I nodded. I didn't like his sly look, and I didn't like being hinted at to not tell my parents' people anything. But so far he'd been fine. Plus, my uncle had called him to come get me. This wasn't a blood relation, but surely there was some trust there or they wouldn't be friendly enough to trust with a kid, right? He didn't seem convinced, but then I watched his face light up with an idea. You know, it goes best with, let's say, extra cheese pizza for dinner. We hadn't eaten yet that day. For pizza, particularly with extra cheese, I'd keep my lips shut for life. I told him as much. All right then. Tripp proceeded to get up and clink around in some bottles stowed away in the console table. He came back with 2 glasses, a jelly jar glass with Coke for me, and a tumbler with ornate cut glass etchings full of something the color of maple syrup for himself. 1 phone call later and we settled back in for another movie, one with a possessed doll terrorizing a military boarding school. Pizza arrived, but Tripp didn't seem to want any, going instead for a refill on his drink, then another. Finally, he did away with the fancy glass and just took the bottle to his stubbled lips, smacking them and emitting, "Yep, just what the doctor ordered," and that hits the spot occasionally. The doll was replacing blanks, maybe paintballs, with actual bullets on the screen when Tripp started speaking again. You know, accidents happen. I looked at him, then down at my shirt, expecting he was remarking on my spilling something. My shirt was clean. He saw my look and clarified. Like there, you got a bunch of blanks, someone sneaks in a real round out of the wrong pile. Not meant to, but it happens. I kept my eyes glued to the screen. As with his sly look, I was getting an uncomfortable feeling about where this was going. Tripp's eyes, when I glanced, were looking glassy, and his speech was sort of melting into run-on words. I'd never been around someone drunk before, but animal instincts told me we were in unplanned territory. Had an accident myself, you know? He paused then. My eyes were still glued to the screen, but that building storm of danger told me he was waiting for a response. I answered. Sure, your Uncle Tripp had an accident, more'n one. But all this here, this movie, makes you think. I went hunting out with a friend of mine. We had us a pair of rifles like those. He motioned to the movie with the bottle suddenly, flinging a few drops of the maple syrup liquid out. One landed on my face. I licked at it and immediately regretted it when it burned. Not just those, though. We had a couple of airsoft rifles, too. You don't need more than a pellet to take down some of these birds, small stuff. So we went out, hunting maybe squirrels, maybe rabbits, off-season. Now, we've lived here our whole lives, you know? Licensing, that's for tourists. He spat, lighting up another cigarette. I wondered if I could somehow tuck my nose into my shirt without upsetting him. So me and Bobby, big old boy, loved him some hunting. We went out at twilight. See, a lot of animals, they know better than to come out during the day. That's when people's around, their biggest threat. But at night, here they come, creeping along. And there's me and Bobby, just waiting. We'd picked off a couple of squirrels, a rabbit, when we saw something rustling around in the bushes. Bobby told me to be quiet and aimed his airsoft rifle at the bushes, waiting to see if it poked its head out. I pulled up my airsoft rifle too, took aim. Bobby was good, but no sense letting real game get away, right? Better safe than sorry, bird in the hand. That sinking feeling from before was back. The doll on the TV screen was running around on a full spree at this point, but all I could see was woods, and 2 men, likely stumbling drunk, aiming guns. An accident, I thought, not liking where this seemed to be going. And then, a flash of brown. Bobby and I both shoot, and bang! Wouldn't you know it? But Bobby had picked up the wrong gun. The real one. The rifle we brought for big game. He paused again, as if sensing a judgment I didn't say. Or, for bears. Things that were too big so we could defend ourselves. Happens, you know. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. Whatever telepathy Uncle Tripp seemed to have thought we had didn't pick up my increasingly frantic thoughts of, oh no, I don't want to know, please don't tell me no. He continued. I told him, Bobby, you dunderhead, you got the wrong gun. See, if it was small game, that blast would have blown it to smithereens. No good meat there. Still, we got up and walked on over to figure out what it was we'd hit. And you know what we found? No? Please be a deer. Please be a deer or a boar or something, I thought. But then again, would hitting one of those be an accident? I glanced at Tripp and decided not. Nothing. Whoosh! Big sigh of relief. Except a blood trail. Lot of blood. And what's more, behind those bushes was a moonshine still. A moonshine. Still? I had never heard of such a thing, and I guess my face said as much, as Uncle Trip sloshed his bottle up at me. Homebrew. Little outfits out in the woods where men make their own, adult beverages? My voice was a squeak, my fear settling in. He grinned, clapped me on the back so suddenly I nearly dumped my forgotten Coke. Exactly. Chuckling, he sat back against the couch and took another long swallow. And I must say, it's pretty good stuff. Shame if he ain't around to brew more. He saw me look at him and chuckled again. We decided that it was best we didn't follow after him. You know, him being out there on illegal purposes and all. I looked with dawning horror at the bottle, then beyond Uncle Trip to the console table he'd left open. It was full of identical, unmarked bottles. I did not remark to Uncle Trip that he and Bobby were also out there on illegal grounds. It seemed a lot less important than wondering if whoever had been shot, had lived, was still alive, out there. My eyes shot back to the bottles. With the way he drinks, it had to be pretty recent. What if... We fell into a silence after that, with Trip nodding off on the couch. I removed myself and took up a curled position on a battered Barcalounger and watched for dawn. I nodded off eventually, because when I opened my eyes the next morning, Trip was no longer on the couch. I got up and gathered what little I'd taken out of my duffel bag and wandered towards the door. Uncle was supposed to stop by that morning to collect me, and I needed out of the house. The porch was as good a place as any to wait. I had one hand on the doorknob when I heard a throat clearing behind me. "Morning, kid. Guess you slept all right. My head's pounding." Trip was leaned up against the doorframe between the living room and kitchen. His free hand held a coffee cup that wasn't quite maple syrup colored, but I had my suspicions. Suspicions confirmed when he came closer, and the smell of that acid sour mash came close, cutting through the dense secondhand smoke scent. I turned, squeaked out a "good morning," and then rambled on about my uncle being over any minute. Trip looked at me, then back around the living room. He nodded once. "Probably best you wait outside." I breathed a breath I didn't realize I was holding and turned the knob to escape. But what? I was frantic now. Uncle Trip looking towards me, his eyes less glassy, his resolve clear in the light of day. He reached out, and at once I could picture him throttling me with that hand, but it landed heavily on my shoulder. "Now, remember what we talked about, boy?" "Yeah, no. I was awful tired," I stammered, not wanting to remind him he'd just admitted to murder a few hours prior, to a kid who was no relation to him, who was currently supposed to be with family. About being old enough to keep secrets? My stomach was ice, but now it began to thaw with a spark of hope. "Oh, yes, sir, I can keep secrets." I looked pointedly at his coffee cup, then desperately back at his face, hoping he didn't remember his drunken confession, hoping he'd think I only meant about him drinking alcohol with me around. My parents drink wine sometimes. No big deal." I planted a big fake smile on my face and waited, hoping he'd buy it. He looked at me. I'd taken him for old, maybe not so smart, but his eyes told me he knew exactly what I was up to. Still, he smiled, saying, "Good, because you're old enough for secrets now, but you want to get older still yet. Get some secrets of your own, right?" The threat was there, and all I could do was nod, my throat suddenly feeling like I'd swallowed an extra cheese pizza slice without chewing. The weight of his hand lifted as a car horn blatted outside. "Well then, off you get." I was out of that house like a shot from an airsoft rifle.